Welcome to the Rangeland and Equipment Technology Council session. Novel equipment in the Western United States. We're getting a little bit short start, but there is a slight change in the agenda. One of our speakers ended up sick, and so the second speaker, Scott Jensen, will accommodate. We're going to give a little more time to Bill and Danny to cover some of what Scott was going to cover and address those things there. But just to give a really brief, I was hoping to do this before the hour started, but the RTEC, the Rangeland Equipment and Technology Council, is a informal group of like-minded people that are interested, obviously, in equipment and in technology for the purpose of restoration. I usually have some sign up and I've neglected to do that. But if you are interested or you think you can contribute to this group, we meet quarterly just to discuss. It's largely revolves around these sessions each year to help, spread different things regionally. And so if you feel like you'd like to participate, contact me, Kevin Gunnell at utah.gov. So the organizer of this session, just my full name at utah.gov. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and actually get your presentation started. And he's going to talk to us about some cool things with sagebrush. So.
All right. Yeah, thanks for everyone for coming. I'm Bill Davidson with USGS Fresk out of Boise, Idaho. And if you'll notice, this is not the title of my talks. However, it is the overarching theme that I want to emphasize. So it's using restoration to improve restoration, particularly how we can use restoration treatments for research opportunities, how we can leverage those opportunities to increase the effectiveness of restoration efforts. So the ultimate question is, how do we turn this into this while simultaneously learning what worked, what didn't, and why? All of the data I'll be presenting on today are preliminary results. So I'll be talking about two different studies. Number one, looking at landscape and climate transfer distance effects on sagebrush establishment. So 5 years post-treatment, post-fire. And then second, I'll be talking about the additive benefits of multiple treatment interventions in sagebrush establishment. So to start, we'll talk about the climate transfer effects. So the National Seed Strategy calls for the right seed at the right place at the right time in order to identify appropriately adapted seed sources and ultimately ensure effective establishment. And a lot of these guidelines, seed transfer guidelines in particular, are based on common garden studies, ideally across with multiple gardens across some kind of climatic gradient. However, the common gardens themselves can't really characterize or represent the landscape heterogeneity or the climatic variation within these large wildfires that we increasingly see. For instance, the current empirical seed zones for Wyoming big sagebrush and Basin big sagebrush are based on 3 common gardens that focused on sagebrush survival and flowering phenology. As a consequence of these studies, they identified 8 seed zones within the Great Basin, 6 within the Wyoming Basin. But a few issues with this approach is that these common gardens are most often established using outplanted seedlings, which circumvent a lot of the demographic bottlenecks in sagebrush establishment. And, despite how hard we try, they can't really characterize the complex genetic diversity within each seed zone. So in theory, we could use these seed zones. That's not there. So we could take seed from anywhere within these seed zones and expect reasonable establishment anywhere else within that seed zone. But again, bringing it back to the theme of my talks is how we can use restoration treatments to improve and further refine these seed transfer guidelines. So the Soda wildfire burned on the Idaho-Oregon border to over 280,000 acres across a broad elevational gradient depicted in Figure B here on the right. So this fire burned across anywhere from 750 to 2,000 meters in elevation. And the BLM used 40 different seed lots that first year from the surrounding states that originated from anywhere from 600 to 2,100 meters in elevation. So this is one technique that I think we should really emphasize and carry forward in order to leverage these restoration treatments to further refine those seed transfer guidelines. So it's a fairly simple process. We just need to, and I wouldn't have been able to do this without our BLM collaborators. Played a crucial role. Really, all you need to do is to keep track of which seed lots are flowing when, all while recording the helicopter flight paths using GPS, the AgNav software. And we can analyze these GPS files to see which seed lots were applied where. So for instance, this is one polygon from the AgNav files. So the pink area are the areas that were seeded. We can turn, through this analysis, we can turn this into that. So we see within the single area, there are two different seed lots applied. And when you apply this across the entire fire area, you get something that looks like this, where each different color represents an individual seed lot. In this picture, you can see kind of the topographical complexity of the fire area. For instance, this for a single seed lot is applied across a broad area ranging in elevation from 850 meters to 1,600 meters. And then establish our monitoring plots within each one of those different polygons, where we characterize the frequency and density of the sagebrush establishment, as well as the vegetative community. One thing that repeatedly comes up as important in sagebrush establishment are these fertile islands, which are kind of the legacy of perennial grasses or shrubs that burn in the fire. They have higher levels of nutrients as well as altered biochemical properties, which really seems to favor sagebrush establishment. So you can see in this picture, it's characterized by those darkened soils. We also characterize the pediderm, so the soil surface characteristics, a number of other metrics as well. So early monitoring post-seeding is really important for research so that we can determine whether it was the germination that was the limiting factor or later stages of establishment. So for instance, this is one of our plots with 3 seedlings. And especially it takes a lot of diligence when there's other vegetative components as well. So all in all, we established 2,500 monitoring plots across the Soda Fire, seen here. However, something I'll elaborate a little bit more on in the next presentation. Many of these areas were seeded multiple times, so we had to exclude them from this data set. We've previously published on the initial emergence, where we characterize the probability of site occupancy, so it's a presence-absence metric. We did see a positive effect from aerial seeding. We had a 12-fold increase in occupancy over unseeded areas, even in the harshest low elevation sites, where we saw a doubling of seedlings in those plots. And again, just to emphasize that when we're characterizing sagebrush establishment, a majority of that mortality is observed in the first few years. So if we zoom in, again, this is first year post-fire, looking at sagebrush density. We can see the many different colored stripes. They represent individual seed lots that were applied. So we see considerable variation between different seed lots, especially focusing on the left here. We see considerable variation in sagebrush establishment between different seed lots, but also within a single seed lot, we see a lot of variation. The darker colors are higher density of sagebrush seedlings. So we can use this data to really help narrow down on what site factors are contributing to that variation within an individual seed lot. There was a really patchy establishment of sagebrush on the landscape. So for instance, this is the 3rd year post-fire. where we see a lot of sagebrush establishing. Overall, sagebrush occupied 46% of those 1,000 plots, with an average density of 0.04 plants per meter, average canopy cover of 4%, and a height of 38 centimeters. Soil taxonomy repeatedly comes up as an important factor on where sagebrush is establishing. So here in this figure on the x-axis, we have the proportion of plots by a soil taxonomic subgroup in the black bars and sagebrush density in the gray bars. So despite some soil types being rare across our study areas, they were highly conducive to sagebrush establishment. In particular, the mollisols, which contain fertile organic matter and high levels of nutrients, as well as deeper soils that lack extensive restrictive horizons, such as Durapan. The fire history of each plot was also significant. So the more times an individual plot has burned, the lower chance or the lower probability that we'd see high sagebrush establishment. So in this figure, sagebrush abundance is depicted on the y-axis, and those fertile islands that I talked about earlier on the x-axis. So another factor that came up is the topographical wetness index, or sites that promote water accumulation, sites with lower heat load, which is an indication of soil warming, solar warming, and on sites with deeper soils. In terms of climate transfer effects, we saw the highest establishment on plots with the colder temperatures, the mean temperature of the coldest month, sites with lower spring precipitation, and climate transfer effects in particular. We saw seed sources originating from colder climates establishing most effectively on the colder sites within our study area. This technique of tracking individual seed lots and then evaluating the outcomes of that is kind of limited in the fact that source identified seed only requires vendors provide the county and elevation of those seed sources. And as a consequence of that, we created a climate tool that used land fire to identify sagebrush habitats within those counties and elevational ranges. And then we extracted climate data from PRISM, and then we had to average that across the entire area in order to calculate our climate distance metrics. So if vendors could provide higher resolution, like coordinates, for instance, of these source populations, we'd be able to refine this approach. So in conclusion, higher densities are observed on colder sites, with seed sources originating from colder sources overall. And just an example of how we can leverage restoration projects as research opportunities to further refine these seed transfer guidelines. And if we had better seed source information, we could further refine this approach. Next, I'm going to cover the additive benefits of multiple treatment interventions to reestablish sagebrush. So just a few months before the Soda wildfire, they passed Secretarial Order 3336, which allowed for adaptive management, multi-year investments for restoration and management, and longer-term monitoring programs. And so on the Soda wildfire, they actually carried out aerial seeding over several years, as summarized here, how much area was reseeded multiple times. They also planted sagebrush seedlings across 660 hectares, almost like more than 500,000 seedlings were outplanted. And so what I wanted to address was a statistical approach that can kind of further leverage these restoration projects for research. So as I'm sure you're all aware, land managers don't apply treatments without bias. There's a whole bunch of priorities about where treatments are applied. For instance, like drill seeding, often doesn't occur on areas with slopes greater than 20%. So when we're using these restoration projects as for research, we really don't have a good control without them intentionally not treating areas that represent the areas that they are treating. So in terms of research and land management, there's kind of a difference in priorities. But site matching or propensity score analysis can kind of limit the effect of those biases to make more fair comparisons between treated and untreated areas. So based on the previous study that I mentioned about using aerially seeded sagebrush, but also previous publications on early outplant success establishment, we have a pretty good idea of what a suitable and unsuitable site is, so that we can consider those factors to limit our comparisons of treated and untreated areas more fairly. The downside to this is that it really breaks down your sample size. So by excluding a number of points, for instance, for this study, we had 2,600 plots. But after site matching and excluding the sites where we really wouldn't expect sagebrush to reasonably establish, we ended up with 1,700 plots. This is, again, the soda fire, the elevational gradient depicted in the figure on the left, our monitoring plots in the circles and the different colored polygons depicting the different treatment combinations. So we ended up with sites that were planted or seeded aerially once, twice, or 3 times, and that combination. Just to highlight, the planted sites are in the yellow, and seeding really only occurred at those lowest elevation sites. Again, part of that iterative treatment application. We didn't see a whole lot of establishment at the lowest, harshest sites, so that's where they seeded 3 times. Just kind of, again, emphasizing the bias that goes into where treatments are implemented and why. So overall, we saw highest sagebrush abundances on sites that were planted and aerially seeded twice. So in this figure, sagebrush abundance, plants per 10 meters squared on the y-axis, and the different treatment combinations on the x. So you can see considerable variation, especially in the planted and seeded areas. Yeah. Again, those soil characteristics repeatedly come up as significant. So again, establishment was restricted on sites with subsurface horizons, such as caliche, durapan, duranodes, and low establishment on soils with low permeability and or high runoff. To summarize, factors that promote sagebrush abundance were sites with lower drought indices, the annual dryness index in this case, plots at higher elevation, those sites with lower slope, high fertile island cover, low cover of perennial bunch grasses, and exotic annual grasses. So, conclusion, site matching is an important method to increase the accuracy of assessing the outcomes of restoration treatments. Sagebrush establishment is heavily influenced by the vegetative and site characteristics, and establishment can be significantly increased through aerial seeding, especially when supplemented with fall planted containerized outplants, which is something I didn't elaborate on here, but we can talk about that later if you'd like. And unfavorable sites will inevitably require multiple treatment interventions to achieve even modest gains. And we may need to develop new strategies to establish sagebrush on those sites. And with that, I'd like to thank you and all the people that helped make this project possible. Thanks for coming.
Danny Summers is going to come up and talk about some novel seeding equipment. So,
hey, like Kevin said, I'm Danny Summers. I work for the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, and Kevin is my coworker. And our other co-authors on this paper are Ron Larson and Jesse Newton. I'm going to be talking about novel equipment for landscape scale restoration. Ron and Jesse are our maintenance or equipment specialists, and they do a lot of this work, and we wanted to get them some recognition for some of the work they've done and the modifications they've made over the years on equipment. So the things I'm going to be talking about here, we're building on previous knowledge of equipment that's been created in the past. Perry Plummer kind of started the big game restoration habitat movement back in the 50s and 60s, and then Steve Monson, who was one of the mainstays on this committee or in this RTEC Council, also played a big part and documented a lot of the equipment. And in his 3-volume Restoring Western Ranges and Wildlands back in 2004. And so this active management, there's kind of been from the the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a really active period of doing management on the ground with equipment like this, and that's where a lot of knowledge was and equipment was invented and derived, and there was a bit of more of a passive management period in the 80s and 90s where a lot of this equipment wasn't used. It was just kind of sitting in yards and things like that. And then in the early 2000s, at least in Utah, we've started a much more active habitat management, rangeland management initiative, which is called the Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative, which is a state-led partnership to improve watersheds across the state of Utah. And that the values that we're doing with WRI are watershed health and biological diversity, water quality and yield, and opportunities for sustainable natural resources. And this has been a really broad and big initiative across the state. And these map gives you an idea of the work that has been done since 2006. The red being fire rehabilitation and the blue being proactive habitat management work that we've done. We've done about 2.5 million acres of habitat restoration in that time. And also we've distributed about 15 million pounds of seed in that time, along with a lot of other work, just to give you an idea of this broad active management that we've been doing. Where I fit into this is work at the Great Basin Research Center and Seed Warehouse. And what we do there is we're kind of a logistical center to facilitate restoration across the state of Utah, where we do habitat restoration research, plant materials development. With the Seed Warehouse, we acquire and distribute all the seed for all the projects across the state. And we do have a monitoring crew that goes out and monitors. And then we have a restoration equipment crew, Ron and Jesse that I mentioned earlier, who deliver this equipment across the state and also maintain it and fabricate. And Ron's been with us for about 20 years. And so there's a lot of knowledge there, and he's really dedicated to his job. And so what he does is, this is some of the equipment that we're delivering to projects around the state, to different project managers. We have all this specialized equipment, and then we have contractors do a lot of the work. But our folks will take this equipment out to the managers, the project manager, and to work with the contractors. And they're always our guys are always wanting to learn, and when they find out what's not working well, they want to find a solution to fix it. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about are these solutions and different modifications they've made over the years. So the first piece of equipment that I'm going to talk about is the pipe harrow or Dixie harrow, which I stole some of these older pictures from those publications that I showed earlier. So this isn't a new idea, a new piece of equipment, but as our initiative started, we acquired what we needed to build these pipe harrows, and they do what they're meant to do. They will thin out brush and prepare a seed bed, but they do a lot of scouring and scraping on the soil, and that kind of seemed to be not as desirable as we got feedback from project managers and some of the data we took. So our next iteration of that was instead of using those pipes with the fins welded on, it was to hook a chain to a header bar, and kind of the chain harrow to try to, instead of doing the scraping, doing more of the rolling action of the chain to prepare the seed bed. And then the next as we started that, then they wanted to get that header bar off the ground, and so we added tires, foam filled tires to the implement as well, and that helped. You didn't need as much horsepower to move it, and it alleviated that scraping action and just let the chain do the work behind it. And so that's kind of where we are now. We have these in different versions, from 28 feet wide to 24 to 15 to about 10 feet wide. And so with these are some of the modifications and the components that are needed. You need a swivel, which is on the top left there, which is just a dozer roller, then have different parts welded onto it to connect to the header bar and to the chain. And then we've gone from different ways to pin the chain to the header bar, to using just a pintle hitch that can be changed out as it wears out. And then on the far right, these little brush catchers or protect the wheels from getting brush wedged in there. These are all, the trial and error adaptive management that our guys have learned over the years, and ways to help with this type of equipment. And with these chains, usually the chain is about double the length of the header bar minus a few links, and that way you don't want, if it's too long, you'll get just a V shape that doesn't turn correctly. And if it's too short, then the chain will just skip over the ground. And so there's a little bit of science to this madness, and it gives, and this is just, a way for a single implement to pull this machine across the ground. So the next is the Hansen seed dribbler. This was invented back in the 60s with the purpose is, when they were doing chaining projects, often you fly seed with it when you're across the landscape, but bigger seeded species like bitterbrush that are expensive, or four-wing saltbush, you want to make sure you're getting good, getting it pressed into the soil and good coverage. And so they built these seed dribblers that they'd mount on the side of a dozer, and there's just that wheel action to drive it, and it drops seed onto the track, and the track presses it in, and that can be really successful in establishing shrubs as you're doing these kind of projects. Some of the downsides were just, there's not a lot of control on the rate that you're putting it out, and then that tire can just bounce on that track, and for an operator, it's not very fun to listen to that all day. And then in our newer modern times, most of the equipment we're using is our rental dozers, and the rental company isn't really too fond of you drilling holes in their machine to mount it on there. So our guys have come up with some modifications with the same concept of using an electric dribbler. First of all, they're taking a pattern from, this is with Caterpillar dozers, a pattern of bolts that are on there that they can attach this without having to drill holes and not have the rental company be mad at you. But then we're using John Deere Flex planter that will meter out the seed, and then using an electric motor to run that you can then plug into the cab, and so you can control when you're dropping seed and when you're not, and the rate that you're doing that at. And so this has been a kind of, our modern version of the seed dribbler, and you're also not having to listen to it clank all day. Interseeding equipment is another thing that some of our forebears talked about when you're wanting to seed into like grass dominated communities and create as little disturbance as possible. And a scalper is another idea that had been created back in the 60s, and some of our biologists have faced this same problem with grass dominated landscapes and wanted to get shrubs back onto it. And so we were kind of tasked with, well, how could we do this? We were trying to bring this idea of a scalper that scalps off the top layer of the grass and pushes it away and makes an opening for seeded bitterbrush or other shrubs. So our first iteration of this in modern, this wasn't something that we could just go pick up. But so our guys kind of created this. We had this old 1950s dozer, and they built these V plows that go on onto the blade and we'll push it away. And that was pretty effective. But we felt we could do better, and we were able to get a newer machine and built these. We call it the Mad Max. This whole blade has been modified to be able to scrape away the soil and side cast it, and then the wheels keep it floating above the surface so it doesn't dig too deep. Then you can also see that you're using the John Deere flex planters here that are also driven by a motor that are controlled internally in the machine, and then the seed goes down the tube and into a chisel that kind of drops that bitterbrush seed into the track there. Additionally, on the far right here, we have another broadcaster that we've slowed way down is used to seed sagebrush. So this is putting sagebrush onto the track and pressing it into it. And so here's some of the results that we've had with that. The picture on the left, on the one side, we caged our plants there to see what how much browsing was affecting it, and it definitely was affecting because they're on the right. Or on the bottom of this is the other track, and there weren't as many plants there, but it definitely showed that we can have success with this. In the middle there, this was I don't know remember if it was an experiment or an accident of really putting a high rate of sagebrush out on the tracks, and you can get sagebrush when you really go for it there. So, and that's what we want. And then we've also modified kind of the same idea with ATVs to be able to drive into places where we can't get, often in like mastication treatments where we want to seed a bigger species like bitterbrush, be able to drive and get that into the ground. So these John Deere flex planters have been a really, like the name says, flexible for us. These are our corn planters, are also, you can put different discs in there to change the rate, and we've been able to use these electric motors with it to help with one of the weaknesses, which is the chain driven part of it. So I'm going to quickly throw in some of the things Scott Jensen was going to talk about. He's one of our collaborators. He was with the Rocky Mountain Research Station and now is with EcoPoint, and he's been working with us in our division on transplanting and how to get outplants into the ground more efficiently, and doing it by hand, just hand crews, can be a slow process. And so this was one test. This was a hydraulic soil probe on the back of a side-by-side, and you can see how that works, just to help create the holes, and then have a crew come behind and put the plants in the ground. And that's another method is a skid steer mounted hydraulic auger. And this one, you're going to be using bigger plants, and or with smaller plants, you're going to have to be putting soil back into the ground as well, but it's also easier than doing it by hand. And this is a tractor-driven power harrow. So if you're not familiar with a power harrow, it's like a tiller, but instead of the blades being horizontal, the blades are vertical. And so we've modified it and taken the blades off of it and just put the spindle. We've modified the spindle to the exact amount of the size of the transplant that we're putting in the ground. And so then with this power harrow, you can be drilling 3 or 4 holes. I think we have it set up for 3. We have it set up for 3 holes. So the driver can go along and put these holes in the ground and have a crew come behind and and put it in the ground. And so I think we basically went from doing 50 plants in an hour with a crew to you can do about 500 plants an hour. So it's really increasing the efficiency of getting plants in the ground. And there's just some other pictures of the hole it creates. And we've, designed that spindle to be just the right size for those transplants, and has been able to increase our efforts doing this kind of transplanting. So with that, I think that's all I've got.
From Danielle Johnston, if I can find my cursor. So yeah, Danielle Johnston's going to present to us on some work they've been doing in Colorado on soil pitting and some of the technologies and novel approaches there. So take it away, Danielle.
Thanks, everybody. Glad you're all willing to squeeze into this little room. I'm going to be talking about some work I've did, was largely a literature review, along with Rebecca Mann, who's here today, looking at the history of rangeland pitting, and then also how it can be used to address some of our common management challenges that we have today. So the idea of planting seeds in pits is ancient. These are some photos from the kinds of gardens that were made by the Ashwi-Awan or Zuni Pueblo people in southwestern North America. And so we don't even know how old this technique is, but for a very long time, this technique was proven to be successful in helping these farmers survive in a very arid climate. And today, I don't know what they called them, but the white people have called them waffle gardens. And as early as 1949, rangeland researchers were interested in applying this technique to larger scales. So this was a machine called the eccentric disc pitter that was tested out in Wyoming. And the researchers concluded that it helped hedge their bets, because if it was a really wet year, it would inundate the pits too much, so you wouldn't get establishment at the bottoms of the pits, but you'd get establishment around the edges. And if it was a drier year, then you would get establishment at the bottoms of the pits. And so they concluded that it increased the establishment of grasses and increased the number of sheep that they could stock. It has been shown in several studies that most of the time, soil pits do increase the soil moisture that's at the bottom of the pit. Pretty intuitive there. It also can decrease soil temperatures, and it can increase the amount of time where you have adequate soil moisture for plant establishment. This has been shown through numerous studies. The graph there on the left is from Carrie Havrilla's work with others, looking at 7 different sites that were from Arizona. And the seeded plots were in circles, the unseeded plots were triangles, and they were looking at seedling density. So you can see there the pits, which is on the right, increase the seedling density over either the mulch or the con mods, which were like artificial nurse plants. So that was by far their most effective treatment. And then the other graph is Josh Eldridge's work from Western Colorado, where he was looking at well pads, and they had larger pits. So Carrie's work was like kind of the waffle garden style. And then Josh's was made with a front end loader. So these were bigger pits. And he found that the rough or pitted surface had higher cover of native seeded species than the smooth surface. I've looked at this in some of my sites too. This is a location from Western Colorado. And at this site, we compared broadcast seeding over pits to drill seeding on a flat surface. And we had great establishment in the first year in either style of planting. But as has been shown in other studies, things got more interesting after a drought year. So this is 3 years post-seeding. We had a drought year in there with only 4 inches of precipitation, and almost every seedling had died in the drill seeded plots. But we did have some seedlings survive where we had done the pit seeding. So it doesn't work everywhere. It's been shown some of my work and lots of other studies in the literature review that Becky and I did that there's a less effective treatment when you get into more mesic habitats. So in my work, it was like above about 14 inches of precip in Colorado. And so this is from a higher elevation site where we compared pitted on a broadcast seeded to a flat and drill seeded. And you can see we had pretty comparable establishment in both of those. And you might not want to use this method if you do have adequate moisture, because you're not going to get good establishment on those mounds that are in between your pits. So your spatially constraining where your plants are going to grow. And also conversely, I had one site in Western Utah where we didn't have any establishment of any perennial species at either site, pitted or potholed, just because it was so dry. So there's also probably a lower limit. So you have to have at least a little bit of moisture for this to work. But in general, what we've seen in the literature is that there's more benefit in your arid sites and less benefit in your mesic sites. And in looking at the literature, Becky and I found a few other trends that we could pick out. One is that there's a more benefit tending to be on finer textured soils and less benefit on your coarser textured soils. And this is thought to be because the pits actually really increase your water infiltration, which you need more on a finer textured soil. On a coarser textured soil, you're probably getting good infiltration even without a pit. And then it looks like, in general, larger pits are more effective than smaller pits. So a really tiny pit, like made with an imprinter, where you're not actually moving the soil, you're just pressing it, those are not very durable. They can help with seed soil contact, but as far as like helping water infiltration and plant establishment, they're not as effective. And then the bigger your pits and the broader you make them, then the less susceptible they are to degradation over time. And the degradation could be an issue because you can bury your seed too deep, you can bury your transplants plants even too deep. This was a study back in 1972 by Slayback and Rennie, and they actually looked at different pit sizes. Really like this paper. So the conventional pit is kind of the scale I've looked at and a lot of other people have looked at. And then they had these intermediate pits that they liked the best, which were about 5 feet by 6 feet, and they were deeper at one end. And so it made kind of a mini catchment where you got kind of a little bit of runoff coming into that deeper end, and they had some really good success with establishment with those. And then they had some really giant pits they looked at that they called bulldozer pits, which they felt was kind of too big because it, just kind of scraped too much of the soil surface, I guess, and didn't actually concentrate the soil moisture the way they wanted it to. And then another trend in the literature, it was sort of a difference, not necessarily from more benefit or less benefit, but just a difference in how it operates on a flat surface versus a steep surface. So on a flat surface, like this photograph is showing, you're concentrating your rainfall, you're holding your rainfall. On a steep surface, you have more opportunity there to concentrate and prevent that overland flow, but you also have more susceptibility to degradation, to burying your transplants and burying your seed too deeply. And this photo is from a site in Africa where farmers were using that technique. And so I think even though there's, a variety of situations where these can be more and less beneficial, I do think they are helpful for addressing some of the major challenges we have today. I know we're all familiar with drought and climate change. This was a study I really liked because they went back in time with tree ring data and they compared the climate that we've had about the past 20 years to what has happened since about 1500. And the drought period we've had in the past 20 years in the southwestern part of the United States has been the worst drought that we've had basically in the past 500 years. So, this is unlikely to get better. And I think that pitting needs to be in our toolbox because it's something that can actually help us when we're in these very variable and droughty situations. And you've probably also seen this graphic or a similar one. This is Bethany Bradley's map of cheatgrass invasion in the Great Basin. And pits actually help with cheatgrass too. So I've looked at that in some of my own work. We did fluorescently marked cheatgrass seeds and we compared how they spread out over a flat surface versus a pitted surface. And not too surprisingly, the seeds spread out more over your flat surface. And this dispersal has really big implications for the landscape and for how it recovers. So cheatgrass seeds really like to be isolated. If you do really good cheatgrass control on a site and you end up with maybe just like 1 or 2% of your seeds remaining viable, you're actually not in a very good position because those seeds are going to grow like gangbusters and produce seed like gangbusters. So there's a 1955 study that looked at the seed production of an isolated cheatgrass plant versus ones that are growing in a dense stand. And it was like a 40 times amount of seed difference. You're getting 40 times as much seed when your plants are isolated. And so if you have a situation after a fire, after a ground disturbance, or after herbicide treatment, where you have a lot of bare ground and not much opportunity for those seeds to get caught on anything, they bounce around I just learned this word this morning. It's called saltation, when things kind of roll along the ground surface. You get that saltation with these seeds. And so the second generation of cheatgrass plants is also highly productive. They're that's not a big scale dispersal, but they're isolated enough from each other that they're growing a lot of seed. And that's why after fires, you might reduce your seed bank by like 98%. But that remaining 2% of the soil or of the seed bank that is going to really recover quickly. And that's why you have an issue after fires. So you can interrupt that process by introducing obstructions like pits. And this is one of my sites in Western Colorado. And so you see when you have the pitted surface, you still have that first generation of really isolated cheatgrass plants, but now the seeds are likely to fall into the bottom of a pit and have to compete with each other. And so your second generation is much less productive, and you're giving yourself, you're buying yourself some time, and you're buying yourself part of the landscape at least, when you could maybe get something to work. And so it's not a silver bullet. I watched this site, and you can see the edge of the treatment area there. This was like 2 years after we did it. And then I went back like 4 years and 6 years. I didn't take very good photos, but I could see that the cheatgrass kind of worked its way in over time from that edge. And it will, it's still going to disperse. It's still going to, and now the site is full of cheatgrass, and we're probably going to go back with a little bit of indaziflam and try to save what we got. But the point is that we were able to get something established. We got four-wing saltbush, and we got perennial grasses established here that we probably couldn't have otherwise. So here's some data more to show that. That site I mentioned at Nashwash, where we got nothing established, we still did see that the pitted plots had lower annual grass density, and that was like cheatgrass and as well as Japanese brome there. And then this was a site, I should mention, both at Nashwash and the prior slide, we combined that with some imazapic herbicide. So it's a good complementary technique if you want to keep your herbicide levels light. This graphic here from Standard Ridge was a higher elevation site where we did no herbicide. So this was just purely the effect of pitting versus your flat surface on what it did to the cheatgrass. And we had the same seed mix that was used at the same seeding rate. So I have seen sites where the pitting did not help control cheatgrass. I had a site called Mountain Island in Western Colorado where it was just super dry when we were trying to do that treatment. We couldn't get a very good dig. And we did see an improvement and establishment of perennial grasses there, but we did not see an effective cheatgrass. Whereas these other two sites we did. And I think part of the reason it's helpful is you're actually burying some of that seed. And I do think you need to be pretty aggressive, and you need to treat most of the soil surface if you're going to look for that cheatgrass effect. So it's beneficial. And I wanted to go through and show you a little more because I like historical equipment photographs, which I think I'm got the right audience for that. So I've already mentioned the eccentric disc pitter. So there's also the pitting seeding implement that was done in the 50s. These two are, well, the top one there is commercially available today in Australia. The camel pitter is pretty cool because it's only $1,000 and you can pull it by a truck. So it's good for these places where you don't have a lot of money. And then Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we built a custom gang of notched discs, and we put some true extra seed boxes on top of it, and we've been using it. And then also in the literature, Becky and I found out a whole bunch of other names that these things have been called. The cutout disc pitter, the range pitting machine, the rotary or Calkins pitter, the modified disc plow, gouger, Lee pocket seeder, the bush and bog harrow, the dammer diker, and the pitting lister. So anyway, this is not a new idea. And I was wondering why we don't pit more, when it's been shown to really be helpful and beneficial. And so we were thinking of some of the reasons this might be. One is that it is a big ground disturbance. So if you have anything that you're going to want to preserve, it's not the kind of treatment you're going to want to do. It's going to be a place that's very degraded where you might want to use this. And if it's that degraded, is it really worth investment? Do you want to put your time and your money and your seed out there? I would argue that as things, progress with all the management challenges that we have, we're going to have more land like this, and we're going to need to start thinking, can we do anything here? And I think that we can at least do something more often if we try seeding with our pits. Some other barriers that might come into play are some of our administrative ones. If you're going to disturb ground on federal land, then you have to, go through a NEPA process and survey for archaeological artifacts. So that may be another reason why in the United States, at least, this hasn't gained more traction. But there are some places where it has been adopted. So there's a couple photos from Becky's work in the Uinta Basin. And there, it's a lot of well pad and oil and gas development. And this tread twisting technique with bulldozers has been adopted, where you kind of kick the dirt to make a pit using the bulldozer. And they've had some success with establishing things that way. So we have a paper that's coming out, I think, in the next issue of Rangelands. If not, it'll be the one after. So you can be on the lookout for it. It's got the exactly same title as the title of this talk. And so if you didn't take any notes today, it's all there. Wanted to really shout out to a few people in particular. Ivan Archer and Derek Lavoie built the custom pitter that CPW has, which enabled a lot of my own research. It was really fun to work with people who could do that kind of stuff. Like you guys have in Utah, you have a lot of people with those cool skills. And then great support from other people within CPW, technicians taking lots of data. We had great partners with BLM, both Becky and I did, from several different field offices, people with the Utah DWR, Kevin helped us out, and then USGS and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as several partners from industry who've been great to work with. So that's all I had, and I'll look forward to your questions after we're all done here.
Looking at some seed-based technologies and restoration, and I feel like I shorted them. They were kind enough to come, and two groups give 10-minute talks on the technologies that they're developing. Our first is going to be Corinne Schroeder from the Nature Conservancy in Oregon, and they're talking about some of their work there, and then I'll introduce Matt when he comes up as well. So
Not at all.
All right. Oh, hey everyone, my name is Corinne Schroeder, and I'm going to give a brief overview today of what TNC's innovative restoration work entails. So the title of my talk is Restoration in the Sagebrush Sea Using Carbon-Coated Seed, and I'd like to say a quick thank you to my supervisors Owen Bauman, Cameron Duquette, and Olga Kildasheva for helping me put this presentation together. The need. Giving native perennial bunch grasses a leg up on annual invasive grasses. There's been a need identified in the sagebrush sea relating to annual invasive grasses and their impact on native bunch grasses. Annual grasses like cheatgrass have been a challenge since their introduction and establishment in the Great Basin for decades. Their competitiveness, shallow root system, prolific seeding, and contribution to the extreme fire cycles have alerted people to what this ecosystem stands to lose. How can we as land managers and landowners help our native grasses get a leg up on the situation? One solution is herbicide protection. On this graph, we have a red line, which shows the density of annual weeds, and then we have a dashed blue line showing herbicide effectiveness. The x-axis is years after herbicide application, and the y-axis is a gradient that goes from low to high. One way we can try to help our native bunch grasses is by using a strategic combination of herbicide and planting time. Typically, herbicide is put down and then a waiting period ensues before planting of desired species can happen. And that is around this mark. This means that with pre-emergent herbicides, you can't seed right away with bare seed after an application. You have to wait a little bit, and unfortunately, during that waiting period, your herbicide effectiveness goes down. But what if there was a way to seed soon after putting down herbicide without affecting the desired seed? What if you could seed right there? So that's where we are seeking to come in. The ARS started working on herbicide protection in the early 2010s, and soon after, they partnered with the Nature Conservancy to develop carbon seed coatings for native bunch grasses and sagebrush. The early days of this coating is pictured on the right underneath the pen with those chunky pellets, and there were multiple seeds per pellet. They were also made in-house, which I don't want to steal Owen's thunder, even though he's not here today, but he has a really fun way of explaining that, and I think a pasta maker was involved. These days, we've gone from making pellets in-house to partnering with a seed tech company by the name of Germains, and they've allowed us to be able to scale up by manufacturing a coating that goes just around 1 seed. And before moving on, I would like to say that the concept of herbicide protection, it's not new. It's been used in agriculture for a while, but it hadn't necessarily crossed over into the restoration world. So how do they work? The idea around coating seeds in activative carbon is that the carbon absorbs the herbicide, creating a safe zone where native seeds can establish. Weed seeds outside of the zone don't get this benefit. Therefore, the herbicide targets the weed seed, but it leaves the seed that we want to plant there out there unaffected. So the graphic sort of shows that. Again, that's more of a graphic with the older style of pellets with the multiple seeds per pellet, but the idea is the same. You have 1 seed in a pellet, protects it from the herbicide, or coated with carbon. I shouldn't say pellet anymore. Lab and field tests. So the ARS and TNC collaboration has produced dozens of lab trials in over 25 field trials in 6 states, testing over 200 different prototypes. Once prototypes are developed, they are tested in the lab, and after lab testing, they are brought to the field to evaluate their efficacy in real-world conditions. Lab tests help us control variables and get results, while the field tests are meant to observe what happens in real-world conditions. TNC stegocytes help with understanding how the carbon coatings perform across a wide variety of conditions in the Great Basin, and our STEGA acronym stands for Seed Technology Experimental Garden Array. And on this slide, you can see one of our stegocytes, which is in Nevada, and then one of our lab trial photos that happened this fall. It's important to keep in mind that we want to scale up. The restoration needs in the Great Basin are so great that there just isn't enough manpower or money to constantly be watching over new plants that go out on the landscape after disturbance. We really need to be able to set seed and forget about it. And if we can give those seeds even a modestly higher chance of success, then that's a huge win. What we have here isn't a silver bullet. I'm glad that was used in the previous talk because I feel like that's something to emphasize. It's a tool in the growing toolbox of restoration practices. Another thing we've recognized in our investigating is how to make minor modifications to current seeding equipment like Rangeland seed drills. They need to be compatible with our coated seed at the end of the day. We've been working on reducing the amount of material in our coatings while still maintaining herbicide protection with a lot of success. This reduction of material means that our seeds will hopefully go through the seeding equipment much easier, bring a cost reduction when it comes to shipping, and cut down on storage space for people who want to store the seed. It's our hope that all this will grant flexibility to managers and allow us to remove some of those barriers to adaptation. This is a series of photos. I'm not going to explain a lot of things in depth with the interest of time, but if you have questions, when it comes time for the panel, feel free to ask away. We've modified the drill quite a bit, but it is easily reversible and it's kind of fun to be working on a drill. So how do we measure success? We have found that this type of herbicide protection can boost native perennial grass establishment 2 to 5 times in the presence of herbicide compared to bare seed in some cases. Even a small increase in success is huge when decent conditions for restoration success are present, especially in the Great Basin. So these field results in the graph are from our most recent trial, tested in 3 western states of Nevada, Oregon, and Wyoming for 3 species, all in the presence of herbicide. As you can see by comparing the bare seed, which is the light bar, to the coated seed, which is the middle gray bar, we are often getting significantly higher late season seedling counts for the coated seed than the bare seed, which can sometimes be dramatic. This has been pretty typical for our field trials, where some species and some sites show this and others don't. And usually it's because it just wasn't a good year for those species to establish. Whoops. Getting ahead of myself. And then the photo on top of the graph, it's from our Oregon field site. You can see the effect of herbicide by all those weeds behind the yellow dash line. The coated seed has all the plants, and the bare seed doesn't look so great. So it just goes to show that the coatings do have an effect, which is pretty neat to see. So what is next? We are continuing to monitor and evaluate our multi-state field experiments, and we're also beginning to take steps with our partners like the BLM to install larger demonstrations across a wide variety of sites in the Great Basin. And I just want to say, if anyone is interested in hosting a demo site, please see me or any of my supervisors after, because we would love to put in more demos. To date, we have only worked on a few key grass species that are common throughout our region, and those are blue bunch wheatgrass, squirreltail, and did I already say Sandburg's bluegrass? I don't think it, and Sandburg's bluegrass. But we are considering expanding our testing to other species if we can. So before I wrap up, I want to acknowledge the folks on our Wyoming team who have also contributed a lot of time and effort to studying this as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the ARS, which is located at the station that I am based out of in Burns, Oregon. And they're not here, but my 2023 seasonal field techs worked very hard this summer doing the lab trials as well as monitoring our stega sites. And Germains, who enables us to scale up by creating the coatings for these seeds. And with that, I'd like to say thanks, and I look forward to your questions at the panel.
Thanks, Corinne. All right, so yes, we will now move to Matt Madsen. Okay, cursor. Okay, double screen. Not very well lined up. I'll pull up his talk. Dr. Matt Madsen comes to us from BYU, and he'll be discussing some coding specifically on Palmer Penstemon, I believe. So, Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. That was a great talk with the carbon coatings. So excited to share with you the work we're doing to try to improve Penstemon establishment. And to start off, I'd just like to say Penstemon are pretty cool, right? And I love working with them because look at how pretty they are, right? And not to mention, we've got over 270 Penstemon in North America. Quite impressive, the number of genera there, and valued for things like pollinators, used by pollinators and other insects. I mentioned the visual appearance on the landscape being used more and more, not only like for rangelands, but xeric gardens. And great, for this subject here with restoration or mineland reclamation. They're early cereal species that can colonize disturbed and degraded sites, listed as a desirable forage, and historically has been used for medicinal purposes as well. And, looking at this big, beautiful Penstemon here, we see lots of flowers. It's going to produce a lot of seed. And that seed's going to go down, get into the soil, and it's going to, be there for when that Penstemon dies. It's going to replace it. So hence that seed dormancy is really valuable for the long-term survival of this species. But now, today from a restoration scenario, fire comes through, we've got to seed that, and we need those species that we seed to germinate and grow within that first year or so. Because if they don't, we know cheatgrass, other invasive weeds are going to come in and take over. And so just, changing the genetics, breeding species that would germinate quickly maybe is not advantageous, right? Because that's part of their strategy. We need to preserve those genetics. So is there a way we can deal with this dormancy and still get them to establish quickly and successfully to keep our weeds out and improve ecosystem function? Well, looking into dormancy of Penstemon, primarily physiologically dormancy, meaning there's a block there to dormancy associated with the hormone abscisic acid, or abbreviated on the diagram ABA. So ABA is in the seed, it's stopping the germination, and then as that seed sits in the soil, and then factors such as climate, things with moisture, temperature, ABA levels will go down. And I'm oversimplifying this somewhat, but as ABA goes down, another hormone is produced in the seed called gibberellic acid, or GA. And as those GA levels get higher than abscisic acid levels, or ABA, now that seed can break dormancy and progress towards germination. Well, we can trick our seeds into thinking they just went through this nice wet year, it's time to go, by adding coating or adding an exogenous application of GA onto the seed. One way to do that is with seed coating. It's an efficient way to put materials on quickly onto the seed. A cool thing about when you do a seed coating, as opposed to say a priming technique or something, is the seeds, they're not imbibed for only a brief period of time, so it doesn't affect the longevity of the seed, or at least if it's done right. So now you've got a coating that can be distributed across the landscape. But I chose this winter picture here to show, now that seed needs to sit in the soil for a long time, 4 months or more, from the fall till seedling emergence in spring. And we've tried GA coatings that we found commercially and haven't had much success. One of our thoughts of why that is potentially, as those seeds are sitting out there, that material is breaking down, it's leaching away from the seeds, so may not be effective. So what we tried to do is develop a coating that would provide a time release, kind of like in medication, we take the medication, it gives us a dosing effect. Well, we incorporated this gibberellic acid within a hydrophobic coating or hydrophobic polymer, and as that polymer breaks down, it slowly doses or releases that GA to the seed over time. And we've tested, in the development of the coating, different polymers. Here I showed quickly, and hopefully I don't bore you too much, but we tested 3 different polymers here: ethylcellulose polymer, polylactic acid, and polyvinyl propylidine. And then we applied this to the seed either as a liquid coating or a powder coating, or we combined the two. So essentially gave it a double dose of a GA. And so here's the results of those different polymers and coating formulations put on the seed. Right at the bottom, then the dark, we see our control, right? So after 50 days, it reached a little under 20% germination, versus all those other GA coatings up above there, are germinating much faster, and they're able to, push upwards of 90%. One of the best coatings that we had, it was an ethylcellulose polymer. And what I say best in that, there's a lot that were about the same, but it was the easiest to apply. Then it had a higher germination rate. And then it was applied as a liquid coating. So it's used and applied in an acid carrier or acetone carrier. So it goes onto the seed, that acetone quickly dries off in a few seconds, and the GAs and the polymers left behind. What does that do for growth? I'm showing the control on the far left, and then the different GA coatings to the right of that. Statistically, there was nothing there that we found, but note we had a lot of different treatments. On average, there's bigger shoot growth as expected, but there's also bigger root growth too. So we're kind of working on that now still to see, maybe with less treatments and decreasing our variability, we might be able to tease out how it affects growth. Excuse me. So let's try it on other species of Penstemon. Here I have thick leaf and firecracker. The blue line represents our GA coating. Black line is the control, and then the red is a coating, but no active ingredient added into it. And you can see the blues right on top. And these are dormant Penstemon species, so strong treatment response. We found a couple other species that weren't dormant, had Dusty Penstemon, Rocky Mountain Penstemon. Here, not, as you can imagine, not as strong of a treatment effect with respect to germination. Now this, here's a study we just recently published by Amber Johnson, did her master's work. And I've picked out a couple of species that she tested, palmers and thickleaf, for the reason that they were dormant. And I'm going to show some results from near Santaquin, Utah. And in addition to testing the GA coating, she also looked at how do you plant these seeds. And she did an approach where she planted seeds in what we're calling a U-shaped furrow. And it's hard for me to make this shape being from BYU, but I'll do it anyway. So as one of the cool things about this U-shaped furrow, as Danielle pointed out, getting down into the ground, there's moisture there for the plant. But also by pushing those sidewalls out away from the seed, now when they collapse, your small little seeds aren't getting covered to a depth that they can emerge, or at least that's what we were wanting to test. So we've got them planted 1/4 inch deep, just on the soil surface, versus 1/4 inch deep in these U-shaped furrows. And to point out, this was an exceptionally dry year, the fall of 2021 into the winter. hardly anything grew or nothing grew for Palmer's Penstemon. But we put GA on, we got some growth. We put that seed into a furrow with GA, more growth. Looking at thick leaf there, GA, again, GA is the white bars. There's a 12-fold increase over the control. Put the GA seeds into the furrow. We've got a 29-fold increase. So it helped, but we didn't have a lot of plants to keep in mind. And why didn't we? One of the things we thought of is just crusting soils was a big issue in a lot of the sites. So we wanted to see, could we bypass this crust by putting compost with the seeds? So you can see those agglomerated compost there in the drill row. And then we plant on an exceptionally wet year, 2022 to 2023. And pretty cool how, it looks like I'm about out of time. Yeah, how, you go and give me another couple minutes. Good, thanks. So with the compost, there's a 3-fold increase over the control, the data on your far side there. But also the GA provided a benefit. And I thought there would be an additive effect, GA and the compost. There wasn't. One thing to keep in mind is we had some really bad delivery of compost. It plugged up in our seeder. And so it didn't work out as anticipated. So we've since tried to see, can we put the seed down and put a mulch or compost layer over the seed so it's a little easier to apply, but still get that improved emergence. So I'll show you, just finish my talk, how we're trying to do it. And this last fall, I don't have any data, but I thought it was kind of fun to this video, so I wanted to show. So here, this is a cone seeder, so it's designed for small plot research. And we have packets that are weighed out, different seed treatments that are getting dropped in. And then we attached to the back of the cone seeder this fertilizer box. The fertilizer box is delivering that mulch or compost material over the seed. And again, with the hope that that's going to help with seedling emergence. So in conclusion, seems like GA has some potential in multiple years to prove establishment. Pretty cheap and efficient to apply. Material costs for us was around $4 a pound. Think about some of these Penstemon species, $60 a pound. So much cheaper for that coating. And then, some of those crazy furrows and mulch material, that also seems like it might have some potential too. So thank you.
I was curious with your carbon coating, what herbicide you were looking at to test how well it could protect it from the herbicide?
We used a Madsen. Since Rejuva has been being talked a lot with a lot of agencies, we are considering testing that as well, because that is a common question that has been coming up, but for now it's a Madsen. Okay, so what I think you're saying is what is the benefit of seeding at the same time of the herbicide application as opposed to waiting? Okay, the benefit is, so with the Madsen, when you put the herbicide down, the effectiveness goes down the longer you wait to seed it. So if you could seed right after you do the herbicide application, you could see the benefits sooner, or you wouldn't have to wait, and then you wouldn't have to worry about your seed being affected by the herbicide. Because with pre-emergent herbicides, we found they don't have an effect on grasses that are already established, but for seeds and little seedlings, they do. So if we're trying to do restoration, and if we don't have a ton of time, or if we just want to give these grasses a head start, that would be the benefit of seeding at the same time as herbicide application.
Oh, the question was, how steep a slope can you pit and be effective? So yeah, for the folks online, Becky summarized that there's not a distinct cutoff with slope, but it seems like if you go with bigger, broader pits, it can help you go with a steeper slope. And yeah, the infilling is the thing you have to watch.
Yeah, so to summarize, what basically you're asking is that kind of standard practice of applying the seed lots in like similar patterning? No, that's not typically documented. And that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that, it doesn't take a lot of documentation to record this information. But the potential to learn from these restoration treatments is pretty profound. So we had to work pretty closely with BLM to kind of arrange that opportunity. And it's not very complicated. It is time consuming and fairly tedious on the back end, but yeah, just with a little bit of documentation, you know, we can learn a lot. Yeah, the question was, what would the seeding rates for sagebrush? And on average, it was about, I think it was 3 pounds per acre. Yeah, bulk pounds, yeah. So the question for that question was, were the seed lots originating from colder sites also establishing higher densities on the warmer sites as well? And in general, yes. That was kind of across the board. But they did best on the coldest sites. And of course, there's a lot of other factors that go into that. For instance, we saw higher densities on the sites with lower spring precip. Well, anyway, a lot of it just factors into competition from other plants, limiting establishment. So yeah, I should note that for the soda fire, the BLM tried really hard to match the seed sources to the seeding area. So the climate gradient in this example was much smaller than what we typically see. Because I did try to take that into account. Yeah, the question was whether herbicide was applied ahead of time, and yes, it was not across. I didn't mention that. So yeah, so it varied across the landscape. So during my analyses, I did include different treatments, and in general, like treatment didn't come out as a significant factor, but exotic annual grass cover did. And from our, other analyses, herbicide did reduce exotic annual grass. So even though we didn't detect a significant effect from herbicide, that, it's kind of a secondary effect with higher densities on sites with lower exotic annual grass.
My question really is, where these aren't broadly available, where some of these methods and things, like what is the first step for somebody who wants to maybe apply them, or where can they go, what process, where can they even start looking to start working towards implementing these different things? I'll start with, we'll just hand it around and I'll try to get Justin's sound working.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what I presented today, it's not really complicated. It's just mostly a matter of documentation. And then the second section, I was emphasizing the propensity scores, which is an R package called Match It. So that's readily available.
I would say come talk to us. As I said before, we are very interested in putting in more demo sites because as I said in my presentation, we want to scale up. So yeah, if you want to kind of dip your hands into it, come talk to me or Olga or Cameron. They're here at this conference.
Well, I'd say the same thing. I think it's pretty cool how they're working with Germain's, private company to now apply the technology. And that's something we've been thinking about too, is how do we get this now into the marketplace? And I think there's two barriers. One is like a lot of the work is, as we've shown, small plots, and land managers need to see it on a larger scale. And so I think, yeah, there's a need for bigger demonstration plots to show the effectiveness. And then as well, demonstrate cost benefit. I think we need to be able to show, yes, you may be paying more, but on the number of the cost per plant on the landscape could potentially be reduced substantially with the technology. And then, yeah, I think get a company that would adopt as far as seed coating goes. Because right now, I think I've had a lot of conversations with companies, and they're like, well, we'd love to get into this, but we just don't see if it'll be profitable. What kind of market is it? And they look at the fluctuating markets and stuff with rangelands. And so they're not really biting per se. But I think as we get larger scale plots and do the cost benefits, there'll be a lot of interest.
Great question. I think there's not a great answer for my talk because it's hard to build one of these machines. If you're in the Eastern Utah, Western Colorado area, you can borrow the one that CPW has. And I do hope to get at least some detailed photos up on the website that Corey and Kevin are putting together, if anybody wants to build one. And I also think getting creative with how you make a pitting treatment. It doesn't have to be a custom piece of equipment. You know, for smaller areas, you could use a mini excavator or a front end loader or the tread twisting technique. I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Okay. So Becky added that it's also just a matter of getting the word out to people in industry and other places.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo that that's part of what we're doing here is getting the word out and just being adaptive. I think that's what I was trying to demonstrate with what we've done with equipment is over time, adapt to what we're seeing and try to make things better. And when we identify problems, just try to find solutions. And usually the first thing you do isn't the right thing. So it's a matter of keep trying and adapt to the situation. Yeah, have a good staff, that's for sure.
I am very sad at how much it has set idle. You know, I've tried to get it adopted more, at least within my area, but I think another barrier is just that it's different. And, you know, people are used to drill seeders, and there's always that steep part of the learning curve when you try to adopt something new and different. And we did have one treatment where we actually broke the machine and didn't get it all the way done. And that's real, you know, that project didn't get done. The next year we couldn't pull it off and we never finished it. So I think, yeah, I think that it's hard sometimes just to get people to try something different. And yeah, mine's sitting idle. How about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination. Some are rarely used, but some are becoming more popular. Like our scalper dozer machine initially we had one regional biologist who was excited about it and he was using it a ton. And then kind of the word was spreading and now we've got higher demand around the state for it all fall basically. So it kind of getting the word out was the big part. I mean, the blade is what's been modified primarily and it's detachable. We put like a regular blade on it for other purposes as well, but that's it. The blade itself is the biggest modification.
Yeah, I'll just add, so we are lucky because there's 3 of us at TNC who are based out of that EOARC in Burns, and they had a rangeland drill. It seemed to be sitting around idle. I don't know that for sure though, just based on the weeds growing around it when we first started working on it. But it was really important to Owen, who is my direct supervisor, to make sure that the mods we made were reversible so people didn't have to worry about creating permanent change on their drills. Because we want this to be accessible ultimately to a wide variety of folks. So we actually have said, hey, if you contact us and want to do demos or whatever, you're welcome to use our drill, which does take some coordination because we share it within the station itself. But yeah, sometimes they do sit idle and they look a little scary to start working on when they look a little rusty or something. So.
Yeah, so there's a question is, can we use the work we're doing with Mineland or mining companies to leverage those funds and resources and projects to improve restoration as a whole? I believe, right? And yeah, definitely. So like for our group right now, we get funding from the state of Utah, improve wildlife habitat, and we're getting funding from Rio Tinto Kennecott. And it really is going towards the same goal, is to try to get green plants on the landscape. And I think that's been a big help. And we're going out into like tailings is an area that's, the ore after it's been processed and put out, we're working in those areas severely degraded and often have cheatgrass issues and things like that. So yeah, I think it does help to expand beyond rangelands for that. And so who would it adopt first, I think is a good question. I think they might be easy to purchase seed, novel products as we show it works on the rangelands. We just did do a project with the state of Utah too, a small scale one where they funded us just to kind of as if we were a business and we coded the seeds, kept track of all the costs. And that also has been helpful. to just kind of get an idea of get the market going, you know, on very small scales. But
question of barriers to entry to the aspen treatment. And so Justin's response to barriers was, it seems that the biggest barrier to folks considering mechanical treatments to treat aspen, whether to regenerate a new stand or to reduce the fuel loadings, comes down to misunderstanding the effect of what appears to be the heavy-handed approach. Treating aspen with mechanical equipment is nothing new. It's been done for 70 years now, and it's highly effective. Applications on private land are ongoing. Application on federal land is limited mostly by NEPA. He says, I should also say this approach to mechanical treatment is very efficient and can treat dozens of acres in a day at a comparable or better rate than other treatments like prescribed fire or harvesting. So, okay, there's that. Thank you, Justin, for being flexible.
Yeah, great question. So the question was about broadcast seeding over pits and whether it's cost effective because you're not hitting the pit for the lot of your seed. I think it is cost effective because when you create that pitted surface, you're preparing a seed bed, you're roughing up the soil, you're creating a microsite at a couple different scales. You've got the pit scale, and then you've got the clod soil scale with it kind of the soil sloughing and moving. And in my own research, I kept the seeding rate the same between broadcasting over the pitted surface and drill seeding over a flat surface. So that was always what I compared because I wanted to compare apples to apples, and it did well. And I think, with drill seeding, you get that precise seed soil placement, good seed soil contact, which is really cool. With the pitting, it's a little bit more of a chaotic process where some of your seed's going to be buried more deeply and some of it's going to be buried more shallowly. But usually in a seed mix, you have things that, need to be buried more deeply and need to be buried more shallowly. And I think it seems to work. I think unless you get too much infilling and your seed gets buried too deeply, which I think can happen.
With the chaining that we do, I think it's kind of the same effect. It's not as deep as pitting, but you're getting variable disturbance across the landscape. And when you're using a diverse seed mix, then yeah, the different seeds kind of have different places where they thrive and do better. So that we like that variation that it provides.
Yeah, I would think up there, that's probably the right way to go. I think you need a bigger treatment the more arid you are. So I've talked to people who do work around the Moab area, very dry, and they make pits that are kind of ski mogul sized. And then if you read around the literature in super arid parts of Africa, they're doing like rainwater harvesting where they have, a catchment area that's 20 times the size of the production area. So they're actually like going really big scale to concentrate that soil moisture. So I think the scale you need to be at depends on how arid the system is that you're working in.
Thank you all for staying with us, and I would encourage you to stay and keep the conversations going. I know we're hitting up the end and people maybe need to shuffle out to find flights and things, but I do appreciate, again, one more round of applause for all of our panelists. A lot of great work, and thank you all for attending.